Good morning, everybody, on Open Access Week 2024. My name is Gita Rosenberger. I am Chief Librarian of the Library of the University of Latvia. My daily duties are related to services for researchers and PhD students, e-sources, bibliometrics, information literacy training, open access, open science, as well as I am representative of Open Air National Open Access Desk in Latvia. Today, here will be held webinar, how to decide on preprints and open access. Before we start, just a little bit about virtual room rules. Please mute your microphone and turn off camera. If you would like to talk, then switch them off after you did it. Please use chat box to ask questions, as well as this session will be recorded and made available for future viewing on the University of Latvia Library YouTube channel. And now, with the greatest pleasure, I will give the word to our guests from Karger, Bess Bailey, Open Science Manager, and Mina Rosenova, a Project Manager for Strategic Projects and Product Innovation. Please, Beth and Mina, the stage is yours. I will stop sharing.
Okay, great. And I will start sharing. This usually takes a moment. And thank you for the nice introduction. We're really happy that we can be here today.
Thank you very much, Gita. Pleasure to meet you. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this morning.
Yes, thank you that you are giving us a very interesting presentation now.
So you see the slides in the presentation mode, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, I believe we're all set. Okay, shall we take it away, Beth?
Yes, yeah. Sounds
Okay,
good.
wonderful. So if we could have the next slide, please.
Sure. Here we go.
Oh, we can skip past this slide
Okay.
because Gita kindly introduced us already. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today for Open Access Week. As Gita briefly mentioned, today we would like to dive into two very interesting topics. First and foremost, preprints, key considerations, different type of preprint service to consider, as well as open access, really the foundations of what you need to know as researchers in order to publish responsibly, and some key takeaway messages. But before we dive into the key discussions today, I wanted to perhaps take 5 minutes or so to give you a quick overview to Karger Publishers for those of you who may not be familiar with us. The next slide, please, Beth. So Karger at a glance. So Karger is a Swiss-based, family-owned publisher that has over a century of publishing experience and expertise, specifically in the health and medical sciences. Gabriella Karger is our chairwoman and board of directors lead, fourth generation publisher, and she works very closely with our editorial team as well as CEO, with this very, very strong focus on quality and building high quality relationships with the communities. If we could go to the next slide, please, Beth. As a publisher, our purpose and mission is to connect people and science, and this is done by connecting complex health sciences and making them accessible for everybody. So our mission doesn't just extend to researchers, but we want to make sure that knowledge and complex science is accessible both to researchers, healthcare practitioners, patients, and the general public, so that we can advance and share science. If we go to the next slide, please, Beth. The core of our business focuses on scholarly publishing. So we have nearly 100 journals that span the entire breadth of the health and medical sciences. Our flagship titles lie in the area of dermatology, psychiatry, psychosomatics, as well as oncology, so specifically liver cancer. As I mentioned, we have nearly 100 titles, and about a third of these are fully gold open access. We offer a variety of different options spanning from platinum open access, gold open access. We're dabbling into subscribe to open options, and the remainder of our titles are fully hybrid, leaving it fully to the researcher to choose whether they wish to make their manuscript open access or not. In addition to, sorry, Beth, if we can just go back. In addition to our journals, we also have nearly 1,000 ebook titles, again spanning the breadth of the health and medical sciences across 25 subject areas, again primarily focused at researchers. If we can move to the next slide, please, Beth. Karger, unlike a lot of other publishers, is not just focusing on traditional scholarly publication. Our aim and our vision is to support across every single critical step of the research as well as knowledge cycles. So in conjunction with our traditional scholarly publications, we also offer a variety of different products as well as fragments to support knowledge transfer outside of academia into practice, but also to patients. So we also offer a breadth of journals specifically targeting healthcare practitioners. These are called our Compass journals. So really here is where we bridge the gap between academia and practice, and we give very, very practical tips on how to transfer complex scientific knowledge into cutting-edge practical advances. This we couple with our handbooks, which are both targeted to healthcare practitioners and patients, again covering the most topical, timely and recent advances in treatment and medical practice. We also have podcasts and courses aimed at healthcare practitioners, which enable them to discuss the latest advancements in different treatment practices, as well as get accreditation in different areas that are relevant. We also produce summary sheets which are specifically targeting patients. So this is again great summaries of different types of treatments, what it practically means for the patients, what type of questions to ask a healthcare practitioner to make sure that they have a good understanding of the different options available to them. So we have essentially a different range of products, services, as well as fragments and derivatives to support both researchers, practitioners, patients more broadly, to make sure that healthcare and medical knowledge is open, accessible, and understandable. In addition to this, if we can move to the next slide, please, Beth. We have a very, very strong science communication and outreach program. So as a publisher, we also aim to not just make science open. We want to make sure that it is accessible and understandable. So not just the healthcare practitioners and patients, but also aimed at policymakers and the general public. So our broad service offering includes animations, once again, podcasts, infographics, video abstracts, lay summaries, white label publications, and we combine a variety of services, including multimedia formats, together with dedicated communication strategy and scientific storytelling to support researchers, again, throughout the entire research cycle, in telling the story of their research and engaging with diverse audiences, both expert audiences, but also general audiences, so the general public. So our mission really is to work with researchers to make science open, accessible, and understandable, to make sure that we can achieve our mission to connect people with science. if we can move to the next slide, please, Beth. With this brief introduction, I wanted to dive into the first topic of our discussion, which is on preprints. So let's start at the beginning. Next slide, please, Beth. What are preprints? Preprint is essentially a preliminary version of an article or a scholarly publication record, which is made publicly available, typically on a preprint server, before peer review. Preprints have become very, very popular over the last 25 years or so, specifically in the physical sciences and engineering fields. The very first preprint server is actually arXiv, which has very broad coverage in the physical sciences. And the intended use is to make sure that research is shared very quickly, so people can see the latest advances and can already express interest and can start building upon this work even before an article is submitted to a journal or peer reviewed. Typically, preprint articles receive a DOI upon acceptance into a preprint server, which means that they can be also cited and built upon. They can be shared, so very rapidly disseminated. As you can see on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a variety of preprint servers, by no means a full coverage, but the most highly used preprint servers are arXiv, which I mentioned already covers the physical sciences and engineering fields, bioRxiv, which focuses on the biological and biomedical sciences, medRxiv, which specifically focuses on the medical and health sciences, and SSRN, which is actually owned by Elsevier, which is a multidisciplinary preprint server. Preprints are very, very prevalent and prominent in the STEM, so social science, in the STEM fields, but less so in the social sciences and humanities. And this is typically due to the dynamics. That said, there are some preprint servers specifically in the social sciences and humanities, including SOC arXiv, Core, which is a preprint server within the humanities commons, and OSF preprints. One thing to mention here is obviously preprints are not peer-reviewed materials, so they should be read and shared with caution. So let's have a look at the pros and cons of preprints, regardless of which preprint server is used. So the biggest pro is, as I mentioned to you, rapid dissemination of new findings and research. Typically, it can take months, if not years, for an article to be submitted to a journal, to be peer reviewed, for production to happen, and for the article to be ultimately published. And this is a barrier specifically in fast moving fields, for example, like the medical sciences, where discoveries are happening very, very fast. Also in the physical sciences, which is why arXiv has become one of the fastest growing preprint repositories. This, of course, rapid dissemination prevents researchers from being scooped before publication. So in the physical sciences specifically, this is almost like a stamp of when a discovery was made. And this is also an opportunity to get feedback from the community before submitting to a peer-reviewed journal, although typically the submission happens very shortly after. Another benefit of preprint servers is that a lot of publishers, including Karger, have very strong collaborations with preprint servers, including a direct integration. So once the manuscript is submitted to a preprint server, if the author chooses to submit to a specific journal, automatic integration can happen, making the submission process and the author journey very seamless. These are the pros. However, let's look at the cons. One of the biggest things to bear in mind here is the fact that, yes, the dissemination is rapid. Yes, we can have that discussion, that collaborative narrative happening before peer review, but preprints are not peer-reviewed. They can change significantly from being submitted on the preprint server to having been peer-reviewed and finalized. So it's really, really important that we use this with caution, because a lot can happen between a paper being submitted, the peer review happening, but also post-peer review, as we shall see. So we need to use this with a lot of caution, and especially, I think one of the questions was, what are some of the ethical considerations around the emergence of preprints? And let me just take a couple of examples to illustrate that narrative. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Beth. So during the COVID pandemic, we saw a huge uptick in the number of preprint submissions, specifically focusing on the coronavirus. A lot of researchers were rightfully putting a lot of time and effort into new discoveries, new treatments, and the field was moving so fast that the publishing houses sometimes couldn't even catch with the demand. Now, with information being available so rapidly, freely accessible to everybody before peer review, this actually became an issue because a lot of this information wasn't being validated. Scientists were basically seeing that there's a lot of new information appearing. Policymakers, practitioners had full access to this information without there being any validation. And this really became an issue because separating the signal from the noise made it incredibly difficult in a fast-moving environment as it is. If we move to the second part as well, the thing to bear in mind is that even if an article is accepted, after it has been submitted to a preprint server, that's not the end of the story for a manuscript. Manuscripts can continue their life cycle after publication. It's not uncommon within the publishing industry that a publisher would publish corrections post peer review, so updates, for example, a correction, an erratum, an expression of interest, or even a I've lost my train of thought, a retraction, my apologies. And one of the key issues is that there is presently limited crosstalk between these updates, whether it's a retraction or expression of concern, and the initial record, which is the preprint. And this is why it's incredibly important for researchers to make sure that they, as much as possible, check whether a preprint article has been published, and to always refer back to the version of record. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Beth. Although preprints are very useful in terms of getting to grips with the latest information, being able to see the latest discoveries, and for researchers to get that feedback ahead of publication, when it comes to building upon the scholarly record, it's really, really important that when it comes to citations, as much as possible, we refer to the version of record. So this is the final published version of the article after it has undergone peer review. So it's important to make sure that the citation to the version of record happens, and you can check this both on the preprint server itself to see if the publication has been accepted. This is typically linked via the DOI of the preprint article on the preprint server. And also for publishers that have a close collaboration with Crossref, with Crossmark, you can check for any updates on that version of record. So again, precluding such a situation as the second example I gave you, where even the published article had an update, whether it be a retraction, an expression of concern, or even an erratum. So it's really, really important to make sure that the latest information is up to date, that you are citing a robust and rigorous piece of scientific record when building upon existing work. Then I wanted to go back to the question that was raised is, what are the ethical concerns? Well, ethical concerns are twofold. A, with the increased number of manuscripts being posted on preprint servers, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of noise, and specifically early career researchers can find it very overwhelming to sift out the robust studies from the ones that have not yet been peer-reviewed. Two, even if a paper has been published in a publisher, oftentimes there can be a disconnect between the version of record and the initially deposited paper on one of the preprint servers. So this connection is not always robust. So it's really, really important to, as much as possible, use cross-ref and cross-mark to make sure that you are citing the version of record and to check for any updates. So specifically any retractions, expressions of concern or correction, to make sure that the information that you are relying on to build upon your narrative is reliable. This is more on the existing landscape. Now, of course, an additional challenge is the emergence of AI and large language models. And of course, these are being trained on the scholarly corpus. Some LLMs are being trained also on preprint servers. So again, this could actually have the potential to pollute the information that LLMs are being digested and ingested with towards research that is not necessarily ethically robust or up to date. So these are some of the key considerations that we need to, as an industry, take forwards to make sure that there is that good crosstalk between preprint servers, the publishers, also cross-ref, cross-mark, and the publishers don't just take a passive role in terms of feeding the corpus into LLMs, but also safeguarding the integrity and robustness of the academic record by holding LLM makers and producers to account as to how these models are going to be used and what data sources are going to be ingested. So these, I think, are the key considerations when we think about the use of preprint articles, as well as emergence of LLMs ethically, as well as ensuring the robustness of the academic record. So with that, Beth, I will pass on to you for the next part of today's discussion, which will look at open access and the different models that we can consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. Hi, okay, so I'm going to start with a sort of overwhelming view. Open access really has a whole ton of jargon and vocabulary and terminology. And if you feel that it's confusing, you're not alone, because even people who have been, who would be considered experts in open access are still debating what some of these words mean and what they should mean and which is the best way. So it can be really complicated. Don't feel like there's something wrong with you if it ever does seem complicated. And my goal in going over some of these is not that you should have a total understanding, of what they all are and have them sort of memorized, but it's good to have an overview and to, have at least have heard what they mean and, get an idea of what you do and don't really need to know and where you can find information. So I'll just quickly go through some of these so that you're familiar with them. So there are different types of open access. And I'll start with green open access, which is based on subscription model that has, that existed in the decades before and still exists as open access has grown. And the way something becomes open with green open access is that it's an article as part of a subscription journal, as always, and then the author, or sometimes it can be the library behind the author, shares a copy of the article in a repository. Sometimes these are repositories from a university. They can be subject-based repositories. They typically don't have an open license if they're green open access, although they may in some exceptions. And I'll talk also about what this open license is. And what this is called is self-archiving. So self-archiving is how we get to green open access. And very often what version is shared is the manuscript, the final accepted manuscript, rather than the version of record. Then gold open access is probably what most people think about when they talk about open access. It's an article as gold open access in the journal rather than just in a repository. So it's fully open access there and can be read as well as shared and reused. It has an open license. And here, usually the model is that the author pays to publish. Under the subscription model, essentially somebody paid for the rights to read. And with gold open access, someone pays for the right to publish the article. And what that fee is called is the article processing charge, or the APC. These models are not perfect for different reasons. And, with gold open access, APCs can be several $1,000s on average. It depends on the journal, but that is really difficult for a lot of authors, and also institutions can't always afford to pay the costs of the publishing fee, the APC. So we collectively, the scholarly publishing community, are trying different models, and one that's been growing is diamond open access. That also has some challenges, but essentially it means that an organization covers the costs. It could be a government body, it could be the university. So there's no cost to read its open access content, but also there's no cost for authors to publish. And subscribe to open is kind of a flip side of that. It's a newer model and something that we at Karger are also trialing. And essentially here, the subscribers cover the costs. They cover the reading costs, as always was the case, but also they cover the costs of open access publication. So authors don't need to pay. And basically, if enough subscribers renew or take out new subscriptions to reach a certain target, then the publisher will make that year's volume of the journal open access. Hybrid journals are something that you're likely to encounter as well. These are essentially journals that have subscription model, but also an open access option. So the author or it can be also their funder or their institution pays the APC so that individual articles, as the author's choice, can be published open access within a subscription journal. I will talk more about this later, but I think another good term or thing to be aware of in this realm is the Directory of Open Access Journals. I will go into a lot more detail on this, but it's sort of like a white list of good open access journals or trustworthy ones. And then transformative agreements are something that authors might hear about. This is where an institution covers the costs for reading, as has been the case in the last many decades, but also they cover the costs of publishing open access. So so the authors, it makes it easy for the authors, and it means there are no costs for the authors. And this also advances open access. And something else very important for you as a researcher is to be aware of funder, institutional or institutional open access mandates. These are basically policies or requirements. It could be from a research funder or from a research institution or your university. And they will say that any research that you publish under your grant or during your work there must be published, for example, as open access perhaps with a certain license or with a certain embargo or no embargo. So there are different conditions, and there can be consequences for authors if they don't follow those. So it's really important to be aware of those too. And there are a lot of resources you can find, but I wanted to point out that we have some explainers and definitions and links on our open access web page. So you can have a look there, maybe for more clarity. So open access in the last 10 years, say, has been talked about a lot. There were some very high profile research mandates by a group called Coalition S or Plan S that even made news outside of the scholarly communications community. It's become very important, something that we hear about, and you might wonder what it's really about and why it does matter, why you as a researcher should care about it. And open access, especially when we talk about gold open access or diamond or subscribe to open, because the green open access through self-archiving doesn't always have these same reuse conditions. But true open access is when articles are free for everyone to read and share and reuse. The type of reuse depends on the license that's used, but this sets it apart from just a free article. Sometimes there are articles that are free, and they may go behind a paywall again in a few weeks. So it can be temporary. They might not be have a license that allows reuse, but open access permanently in the journal, free for all to read, share, and reuse. And as an author, it definitely has advantages. So one thing is that your work can be disseminated more quickly. It may be published, at the same time as a subscription article, but because it can be shared freely without any barriers, it can travel further, faster, and reach more people quicker. And even more so, key is that more people can see it. So the visibility of your work can be much greater when there are no barriers to reading it. And this can have it leads to stronger impact, more impact for your work. There is some debate or uncertainty about whether it really leads to more citations. There have been studies that show it does, studies that show it doesn't necessarily lead to more citations, because the audience that can grow may not necessarily be other researchers who are citing work in scientific papers. But I think it's clear that the potential to have impact is much greater, because not only scientists but also policymakers and other people can read your work, and it can also make a real world difference, because patients, for example, can also access it even if they don't have subscriptions to scholarly journals. And that also leads into the idea of increasing global equity. That's one of the underlying hopes or principles behind open access. Of course, it has immediate advantages for you as an author, but also it can lead to more opportunity for more people, because they can also access the knowledge that we're lucky to have access to. For authors, in most cases, authors retain the copyright of open access work, whereas subscription work is mostly the copyright is with the publisher. And again, we talked about the mandates for open access, the requirements you might have from a research funder or from your university, and the fact that if you publish your work as open access, that you will be meeting those mandates easily is a great advantage. And sometimes full open access is what is required. So as an author, what do you need to know? You do have rights over your work, and you also have responsibilities. So I think these are some of the key things you should keep in mind when you want to submit your work and you want to publish. You should look into what the conditions are for the copyright, what the open license is, the CC license. And again, I'll talk in more detail about that, but those are important for open access work. What are the conditions for self-archiving? Does the publisher allow self-archiving or not? Or is there an embargo? And if the publisher has an embargo, does your university allow you to publish, to share your work under an embargo? So those are some key things you definitely want to check. The guidelines before you submit. And when you want to publish open access, or you need to publish open access, and you have an APC, this publishing fee, you may find that you have support available so that you can make your work open access. So as I said, an average APC might be around several $1,000s, which can be a lot. But you may be eligible for a grant. And if you have a grant, then you can check the conditions. Many grants will cover the costs of publishing open access. Some authors are eligible for waivers. We, like many publishers, do have a program where we automatically grant discounts or waivers to authors from certain countries with lower incomes, lower GNI. And in some cases, publishers can also give waivers on a discretionary basis. So if you really want to publish open access and don't have the funds, sometimes it can be worth just asking the publisher. Certainly not possible in every case, but we also want to support open access and make it possible when we can. And then again, you may be eligible for under an institutional agreement. That's the transformative agreement that we talked about. So it's worth asking your institution. Your library may know. Some libraries also have open access funds to help cover APCs in some cases. So it could be worth asking there, as well as carefully checking the journal guidelines for authors, or asking the publisher. And again, I'm drilling this in, but it's really important to check on the open access mandates that you may be under. And this is a really good resource, the Sherpa services. There's a consortium in the UK called JISC, and they have these web pages that are really helpful. One is Sherpa Romeo, that lists the open access policies of different publishers. So whether you're allowed to self-archive your work in a repository and under what conditions. So you can check there, and that can be, in addition to the guidelines, a way to find out where you can publish your paper and fulfill your mandates. There are some mandates and where publishers don't allow the author to comply, and they may then even reject a paper based on the mandate, or transfer it to a different journal. But if you look at some of these pages and the journal guidelines, you can find out. We at Karger don't do that. We so far have been able to help authors meet any open access mandate that they have. So the licenses, there's an organization called Creative Commons, and they have developed these licenses. They don't replace copyright; they're sort of layered over copyright, and these licenses describe how publications can be shared or reused. So you can see that there are a number of them. but a few of them are more common, and there's kind of a code, a key that you can break down, and then they make more sense. So CC is Creative Commons, the organization. The BY it indicates attribution, that attribution is required, and there are no other conditions. So a work that is published open access with a CC BY license can be shared liberally, and it can be adapted. Someone can do almost anything with it. Yeah, and then the SA is for share alike, and that means if somebody does reuse that original content, they need to not only have attribution to the original author and source, but also they need to use the same CC license. The ND is for no derivatives, and that indicates if you can or cannot adapt a work and change it. And then the NC is for non-commercial. And for us, our standard licenses are CC BY NC, because it protects the work from people who want to use it commercially, and CC BY, which is the most liberal license. And that's become kind of the most standard, or it's a standard that the industry has been moving towards. It's ideal because it does allow for optimal sharing of science and building on it. But on the other hand, it does mean that truly anyone can reuse the content in any way. So it can also be that you write an article and it's published with CC BY, and somebody can, for example, kind of repackage it or put it in an anthology and then sell it on Amazon. And that happens, but I don't think it happens so regularly. And yeah, so that is a decision that you as an author might make. It can be, as I said, that you are required to use one of the licenses, but if you have a choice, you can weigh those considerations. And now we'll talk about kind of the dark side, the predatory publishers. And it's good to just be aware that they're out there. And the thing with the predatory publishers is that, the standard subscription model that was the standard a couple of decades ago, and is still very prevalent, coexisting with open access. That was based on someone paying to read, and there was basically one price, and publishers weren't really impacted immediately if a journal published more or fewer articles. But then with open access and the APC model, it meant that publishers can earn more the more they publish. There has been some criticism about some publishers kind of focusing on quantity of articles, perhaps at the cost of the quality of articles. But most publishers, reputable publishers, all reputable publishers, continue to provide the really essential services to make trusted research, peer review, and editing. And publishers have invested a lot in improving research integrity in different ways. But what happened was, because of the APC model, where you earn more the more you publish, there are some businesses that came in, they call themselves publishers, but really they might just be putting an article online. They're taking the money as much as they can, charging publication fees, and not providing those services behind a legitimate publisher. They tend to be very aggressive, spamming the authors. Sometimes they do the same, going after authors with like fake conferences. They can look very convincing. Sometimes they even just steal names of real people from other journals' editorial boards. They can have names that are very similar to well-known journals. So yeah, they're dodgy, but it might not be apparent. But yeah, they've thrived because of the pressure on scholars to publish, and yeah, to publish more and more. So some authors may not be aware that the journal that they're looking at is a predatory journal, or they may feel like there's an advantage just in publishing because they need to get their paper out there. But yeah, it's really unfortunate. As I'll show, it's not an advantage for the authors, and it's struck another blow against the trust in science that's been under pressure in society. There we go. Okay. So here, I'll talk about a few kind of case studies in predatory journals. This one was really interesting. You can find this in Science. It's now 11 years old, but still probably, unfortunately, quite relevant. This person had a sting, like an operation to kind of catch bad actors in publishing, and they submitted a paper that had a lot of mistakes, things that were clearly errors, to 304 open access journals, and over half of them accepted the paper. And this one is even more shocking because it wasn't just a paper that had intentional errors, but it's not even a real paper. In fact, these two authors, they really just meant to tell this predatory journal to stop spamming them. They were getting spammed all the time, and they basically wanted to say, yeah, just leave us alone. So they sent it in the form of a paper, and it was accepted. So that's a pretty funny one, but also quite appalling that this can happen. So predatory publishers, why is it so bad for the author? Well, it can hurt your reputation if you are published in a predatory journal. It will most likely not be listed in the key databases, or if it was at some point, it would be deselected. It means that there will be no impact factor, which can make it harder for you in your career when you want to show that you've published your work in good outlets. Essentially, if you're paying them to publish there, you're part of the system, and you're sort of perpetuating the predatory publishing that goes on. And you're not likely to have citations, which is often a goal. And how can you avoid them? And that's also really important. I can't tell you how bad they are and how problematic, and not give you advice on steering clear of them. So what you can do is you can check if a journal is listed in the key databases. You can look for things like, you might get their emails and they're written badly. They look they look dodgy. They're saying things that sound like they're probably not true. And I mentioned the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals. And you can look at that as a whitelist. So that's a not-for-profit organization. They exist with funding and sponsorship. So they're independent, and they have an evaluation process for open access journals to ensure that they follow best practices for publishing and for transparency. So that's a good place for you to look. And then there's a website called thinkchecksubmit.org, and I'll show you a bit more about that. And here I just wanted to show you an example. This one I have received the invitation to publish in this journal. You can see a few things right away that are sort of questionable. They have a mistake by showing two different impact factors. That impact factor is kind of relatively high, depending on the subject area. And if we look a bit closer, it says that their impact factor was given by the Scientific Journal Impact Factor Organization of Morocco. And impact factors come as Mina's an expert. That could be a good talk for next year's Open Access Week. But Mina's an expert on impact factors, and they come from an organization called Clarivate, and certainly not from this Scientific Journal Impact Factor organization in Morocco. So just based on that email, I would already say, yeah, I would want to do some more investigation. So a great place to look is at thinkchecksubmit.org, and they walk you through a bunch of questions. So I won't go through all of them, but they take you step by step through things that you can consider and check on to see if a journal is likely to be trustworthy or a predatory journal. Yeah, and one of them again is the Directory of Open Access Journals, or also is a publisher, a member of the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, which, similar to DOAJ is they work with the individual journals, but Open Access, the OASPA, has a rigorous evaluation process for publishers. So it's very likely that if the publisher of a journal is a member of OASPA, that you can feel comfortable to submit there. So tons of information for you, and I hope that it's been helpful. But sort of, if we were going to summarize the key points that you should take with you today, preprints can be good for you, and they're good for open science, but do use caution and cite the version of record when possible, or check, as Mina explained, for corrections or different things that might have changed with the preprint. Know your rights and responsibilities as an author by reading the journal guidelines very carefully. Look out for predatory journals. And yeah, again, you can find some explainers on our Open Access webpage. And also you can write to openaccess@karger.com. We're really happy to answer questions anytime. So yeah, and now we have some time if anyone has more questions. You can put them in the chat, but you can also turn on your mic and your camera and ask us directly. We have until past.
Thank you, Beth. Geeta, in the chat you had one question, which, just to reiterate for the audience, in which areas is it more common to cite preprints? And I briefly put an answer here with the caveat being that preprints are very, very heavily skewed still to the physical sciences and engineering fields, specifically physics, material sciences, and chemistry. So if you look at even the proportion and ultimately the total number of citations, they tend to be more heavily skewed towards these areas. And I was typing away, but I thought it's easier to elaborate here. So citations to preprints can actually happen for a variety of reasons. One, specifically in the physical sciences, so this is my academic background, I'm a physicist by training. People can cite it knowing full well that this hasn't been peer reviewed, but this is really a very novel, topical and timely discovery that corroborates the research that they are doing. So they cite it with caution. That's being one of the reasons. The second reason is oftentimes, more often than not, when researchers cite, they don't know that the paper has actually been accepted and they can't see the version of record. And the reason for that is that there's usually a time gap between the paper being published and the DOI of the final version of record being linked to the DOI of the preprint. So sometimes also preprints can be cited to disprove a point. So citations without any specific context, citations can be used to basically strengthen a point or to say, don't do this. So we need to look at the citations in context, but generally, as I mentioned, citing preprint articles should be done with extreme caution because I stress these are not peer-reviewed materials, and they can also be subject to significant change pre-peer review, but also post-peer review. And as I mentioned, Crossref, they have a brilliant service called Crossmark that publishers who collaborate with Crossref can be very transparent with the authors as well as readers as to what kind of changes have happened to the scholarly record post-publications. And in a lot of fields, this can be very dynamic, as I mentioned, from corrections, errata, to expressions of interest, or in the most serious case, a retraction. So it's really, really important that when you choose a scholarly record to refer to build upon your work or to cite, you check that A, it has been published, and B, that it doesn't have a post-publication update on it. And if it does, please use that in the context. I hope that helps answer your question, Geeta, and happy to take any other questions as they arise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I suppose in medicine it is very rare to cite preprints, isn't so in medicine?
I'm awfully sorry, Geeta, there was a bit of feedback on the line. Would you mind repeating your question?
I suppose in medicine it is very rare practice to cite preprints.
I would say the medical and health sciences fields are a little bit later coming than the physical sciences and engineering fields when it comes to the use of preprint servers. So, as I mentioned, the two most common preprint servers in medical and health sciences are medRxiv as well as bioRxiv. And with that, I think, given the amount of responsibility that there is towards patients, specifically in the medical and health sciences, it's a lot less common for people to cite preprints as compared to more fundamental research fields such as the physical sciences and engineering. So it's less common to find citations, but that's not to say it doesn't happen.
So do we have some other questions or comments from auditory? Seems that there is no questions at the moment. So thank you very much for your presentation, Beth and Mina. And thank you all participants for attending this webinar, and see you tomorrow on the webinar Science Communication and Outreach.
Thank you very much, Geeta.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you for your time and attention, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.